the project of Zionism has not eliminated anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews in the East or in the West. What it has done is to create a home for Jews. The old Robert Frost expression, the American poet, home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. That's the Zionist project, and it has succeeded. Those who thought, well, the real project is the elimination for all time of anti-Semitism, were wrong. And we still have that fight in front of us. It's just that we have a Jewish state now that can fight for itself and protect Jews.
12 days ago, on October 8th, President Trump announced that Israel and Hamas reached a ceasefire agreement. 7 days ago, on October 13th, the last 20 living hostages held by Hamas in Gaza returned home to Israel. There's perhaps something providential in the timing that we can't ignore. These hostages were taken on the holiday of Simchat Torah 2 years ago, and they were returned on the eve of Simchat Torah this year, escaping the darkness and the torture and the starvation and the depravity in time to reaffirm the sacred foundations of the Jewish people. Military pressure from the heroes of the IDF and the negotiating force of the Trump administration have won their freedom, but that freedom has come at a very steep price. Nearly 2,000 2,000 Palestinian prisoners are to be released, including terrorists with Jewish blood on their hands. And we are grateful that the living hostages have been rescued and restored to their homes. We also have to be clear-eyed about the fact that the ceasefire is already being tested, that violence continues, and we all know that diplomatic arrangements in the Middle East are really written in sand. Our purpose today is to think with sobriety about what the last 2 years have revealed, what they've revealed about the nature of Jewish power, the sort of character and sacrifice that will be needed to defend the West, and the moral costs of that defense. There have already been terrifically interesting and illuminating symposia and webinars and op-eds and analysis of all kinds about this news of the last couple of weeks. I've learned a lot from it. I appreciate it greatly, but I also think that this moment invites a different mode of reflection. What does it mean that Jewish sovereignty was secured and that the hostages were freed, not through appeals to international law, but through the application of force? What does the alliance between Jerusalem and Washington in this crisis teach us about the civilizational stakes of the conflict? How do we reckon with the fact that victory itself comes with costs that will endure for years to come? And what can we learn about Zionism, Israel, Jewish history, America, and the U.S.-Israel relationship from the last 2 weeks and the last 2 years? To help us think about these questions, I'm honored to be joined by Elliot Abrams, our chairman at Tikvah, one of America's foremost thinkers on national security with vast experience in the Middle East. Joined by Melanie Phillips, whose moral clarity on matters of Western civilization and Jewish survival has really never wavered. She offers us the perspective of someone who has chronicled Britain's and the West's struggles with these very questions. And of course, Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, longtime friend of Tikvah, director of the Iyun Institute in Israel. He brings us the wisdom of Jewish thought and the experience of living in Israeli society at this moment. My name is Jonathan Silver. I'm the Senior Vice President at Tikvah and the Warren R. Stern Senior Fellow here. What I'd like to do is pose a number of questions to Elliot and Melanie and Rabbi Pfeffer for us to have a conversation. And then in about 30 or 40 minutes, we'll come to your questions. If you have questions and comments, please type them into the Q&A function in the bottom of your chat screen. Elliot, I want to come to you first. You've, of course, served in multiple administrations. You've watched the U.S.-Israel relationship evolve over the decades. The events of the last 2 years, culminating in joint strikes on Iran's nuclear program and the American diplomatic pressure that brought Hamas to terms, represent, seems to me, something genuinely new. So I'd like to ask you what you think is different. What does it mean that an American president was really willing to use American air power, not just to defend Israel, but to reshape the strategic balance in the region?
These are hard questions. We've certainly had a good close alliance with Israel at times in the past. We have not had joint military action of this type. In fact, when Israel took joint military action in Suez with Britain and France, the United States came into that war against the Israeli position. So I think this actually participating in military action together is something new. There is, of course, a downside to it that we need to be aware of. The question can be raised as to whether Israel is becoming overly dependent on the military alliance with the United States. And this has been a matter of debate in Israel. Israelis have talked about, for example, producing more of their own weaponry, more of their own ammunition, missiles, and so forth, so that they don't become excessively dependent. But I think what is really a cause for optimism here is that the United States right now fundamentally seems to see the Middle East the way Israel does.
Mhm.
That is a place where there are forces of extremism, of Islamic extremism, that need to be fought, ideologically, economically, but also militarily, that sees Iran as an enemy to everything that we jointly believe in, and that has a vision of a Middle East where there are responsible, sober Arab countries that are willing to join with Israel in the search for coexistence and peace. And that agreement on the problem in the Middle East and the potential solution, with all of the difficulties and disagreements we may yet have about, for example, the nature of Palestinian nationalism. Nevertheless, that fundamental framing, I think, is very advantageous to the forces of peace in the Middle East and to Israel.
Melanie, you have spent years on this very point, documenting how the British establishment has lost its moral compass when it came to defending the West, particularly against Islamist aggression. When you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, the way that Israel fought, the way that America under President Trump aligned itself with Israeli interests and came to see them as American interests, do you see the vindication of a certain kind of Western confidence that we all had been concerned had been lost?
I see the extraordinary beneficial effect of an individual who is absolutely unique, who is President Trump. I mean, the moral collapse certainly describes Britain and much of Europe, but America was going through this too. I mean, let's not forget when this terrible war started, when October 7 happened, it was the Biden administration, which undermined and undercut Israel's defense at virtually every turn while pretending to put its arm literally and metaphorically around it. And, you know, if Kamala Harris had won the presidential election, I shudder to think what sort of state Israel would now be in. So you could say it was either the Almighty looking after us or an act of extraordinary serendipity that President Trump came along. Because I think he has a unique style, to put it mildly. He has made himself, you know, master of the world in a way that no other president has done. And I think cemented an alliance for the period of his presidency with Israel, which I think is rock solid in that I think he genuinely loves Israel and the Jewish people. I have a problem with the way in which certain aspects of his personality, I think, get in the way of realizing his ambitions for, you know, instant peace in the Middle East and so on. I think it's a little unrealistic, to put it mildly. I also have some concerns about the fact that he seems to have, as so much of the West seems to have, a love affair with Qatar. which I think is an enemy of the West. It is the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not simply the patron and funder and advisor and conciliary, as it were, to the Hamas. But it is in charge of an organization which is out to destabilize the entire West. So that is something that perplexes me. So, has America found its moral compass again? Look, President Trump, apart from Israel, is putting into practice various measures, his border control measures, reasserting the integrity of the nation and its borders, his actions against anti-Semitism and on university campuses and DEI. All this is good and it's going in the right direction, but I'm afraid the moral rot is very, very much deeper and broader than that agenda. And I'm not sure that he has the patience or even the understanding to tackle all that.
Now, there's an interesting difference of accent that the two of you put on the way that you think about that first question, because, of course, Eliot sees the alignment of America's strategic interest and the alignment of Israel's interest to reshape a new Middle East, and sees that in a very deep national way. Melanie, you focus on individual particular personalities, which naturally leads me to wonder how sustainable that
Yeah.
kind of alliance is beyond this administration and beyond the tenure
Yeah.
of President Trump.
I do worry about that very much. What comes after President Trump? I'm not persuaded that the kind of people on the people on his side, the kind of people who've been talked about, are necessarily going to have the same commitment to Israel and muscular approach that he has. I mean, you talk about force earlier. You talked about force earlier, and force is a word that in the West we've come to kind of fear and distrust and dislike. It sounds horrible. It sounds like you're being a bully. But if you talk about a just war, and if you talk about circumstances in which only a just war can solve a geopolitical nightmare, and I think, the situation with Iran is one, the situation with the Hamas was one. I mean, it's all part of the Iranian axis of fire, as it were. But, if you're up against an existential threat, if you're up against a genocidal enemy, if you're up against a foe for whom negotiation is seen as a type of surrender, for whom their agenda is so fanatical that they simply cannot possibly make any concessions to you and will only require you to make concessions to them, then as in the Second World War, when you're up against that kind of thing, you have no option but to fight. Now, that's something that I think President Trump came to perhaps gradually. And once in the fight, he wants to get out of it very quickly because he wants to be the president that is known for making peace, not war. That may not be possible. And that worries me about him personally. But in terms of the West, where I'm coming from, I mean, I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, but where I'm coming from in terms of where I was born and bred, spent most of my life, which is Britain, the idea that you go to war for a just cause is now considered to be, well, it is considered to be genocide. I mean, that's the state we've got into. You fight genocide and you're accused of genocide. And I'm afraid that's the kind of moral illiteracy that we've come to, certainly in Britain. And I'm afraid you've got it in America too. I just watched, was it Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes talking to Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner. And she said to them, was it genocide that Israel did? I mean, what a question that she can even ask such a question. So the rot is in America too.
Well, the evocation of moral questions, it's time to bring in our resident rabbi, Rabbi Pfeffer. You're a religious leader in Israel. You've written extensively about the war from the very beginning until now. I want to invite you to take us by the hand and bring us inside the Jewish tradition and to take up the question that Melanie is just asking us to think about. Israel did not persuade Hamas through moral argument or diplomacy, or was not, and it was not able to rely on the very beautiful and pure and wonderful multilateral institutions that are designed to make peace in the world. It brought Hamas to terms through overwhelming military superiority. And I want to ask if you can help just reflect on the Jewish tradition and what it has to teach us about the role of force in securing Jewish life.
In terms of the use of force, I think it's very important to note every single time that we take out the Sefer Torah, we take out the book of the Torah for public reading on the main times that we engage in public reading, on Shabbat and on festival days, we recite verses that speak about going to war. We say, Vayhi b'nsoah ha'aron, when the ark travels, then Vayomer Moshe, Moses says, Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu eivecha. Arise, Hashem, O Lord, v'yafutzu eivecha, your enemies shall be scattered. And I find this a staggering insight that is so often lost from most observers. War is not just a neutral or civic need or requirement in order to defend the people. War is a religious imperative, and the only time when the Holy Ark would leave the temple would be for purposes of going to war. So war and the use of force are not something that run against the grain of Jewish quote-unquote tradition. I say quote-unquote because we haven't been doing this for 2 millennia. So you have to go back and retrace a biblical tradition rather than a Talmudic one. But the fact remains that we're living this week in, week out in our psukim, in the verses that we recite, in the prayers that we recite before God, and yet now we're actually able to realize this holy enterprise in the most, of course, real and tangible way. And the point of war, of course, is v'yafutzu eivecha. It's the enemies of God. We learn in Psalms 83, which is being recited for the last 2 years incessantly. The psalm begins with the enemies of God and moves on to those who wage war against the Jewish people to teach us that those two are synonymous. And therefore the use of force is something that, when required in order to eradicate this terrible disease, this evil, is a religious imperative. And this ties directly to the point that Melanie was making. This isn't really about Donald Trump or about the United States. It's about who is going to be the ally or the allies of Israel in this moral imperative of defeating evil and standing up for the good. And there's people like that in Britain, not enough, but I'm assuming there's a silent majority that are with us on that. And there's people who support us across the board. I won't list all the European countries, but there are many. And of course, that's true for the United States. And at the end of the day, it's going to be about that question. Who is going to be sticking up for the values on which Western society is predicated? Those Jewish values, I know we like to call them here or there Judeo-Christian, but these are core Jewish values. Who is going to be the ones to stick up for those values and defend them? And who will be the ones who are going to be engaged in fighting them, in decimating them, and in eroding them? And that's what this is all about. And the one thing that we've seen over the last 2 years, among other things, is tremendous courage. And this is what is required. You know, the entire book of Deuteronomy, which is about crossing into the promised land. What is that book about? It's about having the courage to fight wars, right? Chazak ve'ematz, right? We say often chazak ve'ematz. What does it mean? Be courageous. Don't be like the nation in the times of the sin of the spies, when they lost their trust in God and therefore they didn't have courage. And if you don't trust God, if you don't believe the word of God, the promise of God that will back up the good, then indeed it's difficult to find a source for that. courage, because who says the good will prevail? But over the last 2 years, we've seen tremendous and truly moving in the most incredible ways demonstrations of courage, and courage deeply sourced in religious faith, in religious trust in the God of Israel. And this is, in my eyes, in the big picture, this is really what it's all about.
So we should take the full measure of just why that courage is necessary. And in part, it is because of the kinetic threats that kicked off this round of warfare on October 7th. But it is also because of the war being fought, the war of words that has been fought ever since. The way that moral language has been weaponized over the course of the last 2 years. Throughout the war, we've heard constant demands that Israel show restraint, that it pursue proportionality. And yet what actually brought the results was the opposite, was overwhelming force, sustained pressure, refusal to accept terms until Israel's objectives were met. So I suppose I would like to just to continue with you, Rabbi Pfeffer. What does that tell us about how the West should discover the kind of courage that is going to be necessary to mount this kind of civilizational defense?
Well, you know, John, the simple answer to that is a rediscovery of the God of Israel. Ultimately, Charlie Kirk was a very courageous person, and his courage was indeed anchored in that religious faith. And you have to take that example and to appreciate that being courageous means you're willing to pay a price. And of course, he paid the ultimate price, and there's no promises that you won't pay that price. That's the whole point of being courageous. You have to believe in something enough to bet your life on it. And when you have that deep set belief, that deep set trust in the goodness that will ultimately prevail, then you're willing to pay the price. But so many today are unwilling to pay any price. You know what? They're unwilling to pay the price of having children because they don't believe in their own future. And even that price of losing out on your quote unquote individual self-realization because of the difficulties of raising children and having to deal with sleepless nights and so on, that's enough for people to, meaning that lack of belief in our common future and what we have to offer to the world is enough for us to change our lifestyle so radically. We're not willing to pay even those basic prices. And I think that this is a time that requires a deep reawakening, a deep revival. I see that revival taking place, and it's deeply moving. We see it in Israel. You know, before October 7th, before the war of Simchat Torah began, it was deeply, let's just say, not acceptable in terms of the army protocol to have public prayer before embarking on a mission. In fact, they were senior army personnel who lost their positions because of too much prayer in the IDF. And since October 7th, almost every unit before embarking on a mission, we see it prayers, we see turning to the God of Israel, and ultimately those common values are values that we need to be able to communicate. It's up to us. It's hard to make demands of people who are so far away. What are they going to do? But it's up to us to be able to communicate that vision, to communicate that sense of confidence in the good, that sense of belief in the future, and that willingness to be courageous and be brave and to make those moves that, yes, you might pay a price, but it's worth it in order to achieve those common goals that underpin our basic future.
Speaking of the prices of victory, we've touched on this civilizational alliance that for which we all owe enormous gratitude. We've touched on the vindication of force that we've learned over the last couple of years. I now want to turn to, Elliot, the price of this victory. I think this is the hardest question that we can think of. The hostages are home, thank God. That is a cause for profound gratitude. But the price that Israel has had to pay is steep. There are nearly 2,000 prisoners that have been released. Many of them are terrorists. Many of them will likely return to violence. Meanwhile, Israel has withdrawn from half of Gaza. I don't know. Um, the ceasefire is being tested. This is not a unalloyed triumph. It's a victory with costs that I think friends of Israel will be reckoning with for a very long time. Elliot, you've seen hostage negotiations from the inside. Can you give us a sense of how these calculations might have gotten made in government? In your estimate, was the deal worth it? More broadly, what do you think Israel and America should learn about that kind of trade-off that we were put before?
I think that there is no government that is able to function without making these trade-offs. In the Second World War, the trade-off the United States made was to ally itself with one of the greater butchers in Western history, Joseph Stalin. One is always making compromises like this. And I think when it comes to the United States and Israel, I think the first principle for us should be to see who's making the sacrifices and be guided by them. Um, it's quite a different thing to give advice about what sacrifices should be made and what risks should be taken when you're sitting in Washington and you bear none of the risks than when you were in Jerusalem and the rockets will fall on you and your children. And it has always annoyed me, sickened me to see American officials from time to time say, that's a risk worth taking when we were not taking any risks. We were foisting them actually on Israel. So my first answer on the question of was it worth it to release 2,000 Palestinian convicted criminals and terrorists is that's an Israeli decision to make because they are the ones bearing the risk. Now, I think it's a very interesting question for Israelis to debate. It has led to the question, for example, of the reinstitution of capital punishment for the worst criminals, because that would obviously eliminate one incentive in trying to release them. And I think that over time, again, it's easy for me to say, but Israel has paid mathematically from time to time too heavy a price in the number of people it's been willing to release. But this is a democratically elected government, and it has the right to, in a sense, make a judgment about Israeli society and make a judgment as to what price to pay. I think the most important thing for an American to say is that this is an Israeli decision and that we as friends should support it with whatever it is on this question.
And readers of Mosaic will remember, Elliot, you just wrote this penetrating authoritative essay last month about Palestinian nationalism and what it is motivated by and the challenges it presents to peacemaking. The fact that so many of these released prisoners, some of whom murdered Jews, are being celebrated as heroes in Palestinian society, what does it tell you about the nature of the conflict that Israel now turns to?
Well, I think one of the things that many people learned on October 7th, for the first time, though they should have known it before, is that there is a deep stream, first of anti-Semitism that runs through the Islamic world, and secondly, a deep unwillingness to accept the existence of a Jewish state. What I wrote in that article is that the fundamental problem with Palestinian nationalism has been and remains that it isn't about building a Palestinian state. It's about destroying the Jewish state. That has been its goal for almost 100 years, from the Peel Commission report about dividing the Palestinian mandate in 1937. That's the fundamental problem, the unwillingness to accept the existence of a Jewish state. The hopeful side of this is that there are people and countries in the Arab world that have accepted the existence of a Jewish state, from Morocco to Bahrain to the Emirates. Jordan and Israel have peace treaties with Israel, though one cannot say that the population of those countries have truly accepted the existence of a Jewish state. or have put anti-Semitism behind them. I think we've got, we're kind of learning in the West in the last 2 years how deep the strain of hatred of Jews exists in Western civilization too. It's been there all along, and it remains there. And I think viewed from today, we can look back and say that hatred of Jews was something that you were not allowed to express for a number of decades after the Holocaust. But that rule seems to be gone by the wayside now. And now it is possible to express hatred of Jews, and we see it in most Western countries. Now we don't just see it in the Islamic world. So one of the things that tells us is something we should have known. The project of Zionism has not eliminated anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews in the East or in the West. What it has done is to create a home for Jews. The old Robert Frost expression, the American poet, home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. That's the Zionist project, and it has succeeded. Those who thought, well, the real project is the elimination for all time of anti-Semitism, were wrong. And we still have that fight in front of us. It's just that we have a Jewish state now that can fight for itself and protect Jews.
So I think that is the key point, that it is a home, and it is a home that, for the first time in thousands of years, has a Jewish army holding Jewish guns to defend Jewish citizens. And that is what one of the things that Zionism has given the Jewish people. Rabbi Pfeffer, you asked us to re-inhabit a biblical habit of mind in thinking about the Jewish exercise of power. And that is because during those many millennia without sovereignty, the Jews did not have such an army. But during that time, there is, in the Talmudic tradition, a very rich, unfortunately, tragically, a very rich tradition of thinking about hostages, the obligations that our community has to redeem hostages, and the admonition not to do so in a way that would further endanger the community. I want you just to orient us to the way that the Jewish people has thought, our sages and our tradition has thought about hostages, the obligations to rescue them, but the safeguards that try to minimize or mitigate against incentivizing future hostage taking.
Yeah, so I appreciate the question, because I don't want to say anything about Robert Frost's beautiful words, that home is a place where, when you knock, you get allowed into your home. But in Isaiah, Yeshayahu, then the quote there is, Tiferet Adam Lashevet Bait. It's a person's glory to dwell in his own home. And why is it so glorious to dwell in your home? Well, it's because you're able to mold and shape your home in your own image. You're able to mold and shape your home in your character, in the way that you feel at home. And this is what Israel, of course, needs to be, not merely a sanctuary for Jews who are threatened elsewhere, which is absolutely true, but beyond that, a place which is molded and formed and shaped in the spirit of that Jewish tradition of 2,000-3,000 years, which combines the biblical origins and the Talmudic expansion of that tradition. And that's, of course, why we speak about a Jewish state, and not just a state of the Jews, but rather a Jewish state. And how does a Jewish state indeed approach such terrible issues as the one that we're speaking about, saving lives on the one hand, where every life in the tradition of the Mishnah is an entire world, while on the other hand releasing these vicious, and no words would suffice to express the horrors that these individuals have committed. And even though the Mishnah does give us pointers on such questions, for instance, one halachic premise that we learn from the Talmudic discussion, and it's ruled in the Shulchan Aruch, is that you don't release hostages, meaning you don't do everything in your power to release hostages when it's yoter michdei dmeihem, when doing so is beyond what those individuals are quote unquote worth. Now, the very language tells us that this is taken from an entire different era, and the Talmud disputes why is this? Is this because it's going to bankrupt the Jewish communities, or is it because it's going to incentivize those who are doing the kidnapping to do more kidnapping and to do far worse? And of course, that second rationale is the operative one today. And within Israel, there are different opinions about this. It's not a slam dunk either way, both among the popular public and, of course, among rabbinical authorities. This is not a slam dunk in any sense. What is essential for Israel is that those who espouse different positions on this and other grave and central issues for the existence of Israel going forward will be able to engage in discourse, in communication, in talk. You know, the verse concerning, we just read it, concerning Cain's murder of Hevel. It says the following, Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv. Cain said to his brother Hevel, period, full stop, as Melanie would appreciate, right? There's a period there, there's a stop. And then afterwards, next sentence, Cain arises and murders his brother Hevel. Well, what did he tell him? What did he say? The Torah doesn't say. What did he communicate? The answer is it's not about communicating anything. It was an attempt to engage in speech, in relationship, in connection. And that attempt failed. Cain failed in his attempt to reconcile, to engage in the connection. And when that fails, then you end up with murder. And therefore, we have a rich Talmudic tradition. How to apply it in modern times is complex, is thorny. It's not easy. We don't have traditions of how do you go to war? What do you do in cases of exchanging vicious and barely human prisoners in exchange for saving lives? However, we can reach those decisions internally in our home, provided we're able to communicate and speak to one another in a respectful way that ultimately reaches the conclusions based on agreed mechanisms.
This is really a question for all three of you. It'll be my last question before we turn to the many questions that have already come in from our audience. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to add more questions, now's the time to type them into the Q&A function in your screen. But Melanie, I'll start with you. This war in Gaza has reshaped Israeli society. It has strained and at the same time deepened the U.S.-Israel alliance. It has forced, I think, profound questions about the necessity of Jewish power and Western confidence as you look ahead, not only to the next news cycle, but to the next chapter of Zionist history, where we are at this moment. What gives you hope, and what keeps you up at night?
What gives me hope is what we've seen in the last 2 years, which is this tremendous moral strength, not just physical strength of war and so on, and all the daring do and the amazing achievements of the IDF and so on, but the moral strength of all those young men and women who have gone into battle and they know what they're fighting for. I mean, this was so striking to me right from the start, and it is the one thing that distinguishes it from Britain and the morally compromised West, that in Israel, the people who were fighting weren't just fighting to defend their nation against an enemy determined to wipe it out. That was obviously the case. But they were, and so many of them said this, they were fighting on behalf of their people. They were fighting on behalf of a people and a sacred history of that people, which stretched back into antiquity over centuries in which that people had fought and died in order to maintain its core beliefs, its core principles, its identity as a nation. And what struck me and what was so tremendously wonderful about this terrible period was that Israel reasserted itself as a nation state founded in a history based on religious faith, which bound everybody together, whether they were religious or not religious, whether they were Jews or Druze or Muslims. They were fighting for a nation whose identity was formed by a particular tradition, which is what Judaism is. And I felt that, you know, the sort of the three things had come together in a way that had not been the case before. I mean, I see Judaism as a kind of three-legged stool, if you like. There is the people, the faith, and the land. And you can't distinguish, you can't separate them out. Okay, not every Jew needs to live in Israel to be a Jew. Not every Jew needs to be observant to be a Jew. But if you separate any of those things out, you don't get Judaism. And one of the things that I'm concerned about in the diaspora is that to a certain extent, this has kind of bound the diaspora to Israel together in a way that wasn't so before. You know, so many diaspora Jews have been, you know, have felt so connected to Israel during this period, not least because, you know, they have personal investment here in terms of family and friends and so on and so forth. And that has been very good. But what Israel has is this idea of the Jewish people as a nation. And what the diaspora Jews do not have is the idea that they are a nation. To them, I'm speaking about Jews in Britain, which of course I know best, but also it seems to me in America, the Judaism bit is a kind of add-on. They're British first and foremost, and they're Jews secondary, in a secondary fashion. And it's understandable, but it's wrong, because we are one people. Now, diaspora Jews are very frightened by this because they think that means that they will have to up sticks and live in Israel. They don't want to do that. It means if they stay in their diaspora countries, they will be regarded as having dual loyalty. They'll be regarded as being treacherous. They will be regarded as not signed up to the nation and all those things. And that is true. They will get that. They do get that. I got that. I get that. But nevertheless, I think that's the way forward. We Jews have to realize that we are a nation bounded by a tradition and a history, founded in faith and centered in the land. And we can't separate those things out.
Elliot?
Well, I'll take I certainly agree with Melanie on the many things we've seen in the last few years that give great hope, particularly the younger generation or generations in Israel. One of the really negative things, though, we've seen is a sort of paroxysm of anti-Zionism. And we see it even among Jews. We see in the US an argument, fortunately, mostly at the fringes now, but that actually Israel's a problem. Israel's a problem for other Jewish communities. It's called diasporism. We will build true Judaism in the diaspora. Israel endangers Jews in the diaspora. It makes us unpopular, imposes risks on us. It's there. It's very far from being a majority view. But if you compare the number of people saying things like that today with the number who said it or thought it 2 years ago, it's grown. And I don't think the Jewish communities, plural, around the world are yet sufficiently well organized to refute it, because it is, among other things, a heresy. And it's also just plain wrong in terms of power politics. I think what we have seen is the ability of Israel to change the face of the Middle East, and to change the face of the Middle East in a way that any responsible and sober Arab leader who is not motivated by hate and hate of Jews would see as enormously positive and opening a prospect for his own people, for their own prosperity over the coming years. But we're going to have to engage in that battle, we meaning diaspora Jews, and particularly American Jews, in a much more forceful fashion than we thought we would have to 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 2 years ago.
Rabbi Pfeffer, what keeps you up at night and what gives you hope?
I'll be brief because I'm sure there are many questions that people would like to ask. But I will say the hope comes from, I feel that we've been given license to imagine. 2 years ago, in Simchat Torah Tafshin Pei Daled, October 7th, it was difficult to imagine a path forwards for Israel. We were literally at each other's throats. The situation on Israeli streets was untenable. It was a dire moment before the strike of October 7th. And when I look around Israel today, I feel that we're able to imagine a path forwards. We're able to imagine. I use the word imagine because so much of everything that we've been through recently, whether it's, the festival of Sukkot, whether it's these historic, almost biblical moments that we've been experiencing, all of these, they stoke our imagination. Sukkot is about living with God for a week. You imagine something, and then, or reading the chapters of Genesis at the beginning, right? It gives you an image. It's not real life, but it's an image. It's an imagination that you can strive and aspire towards. And I feel that today we have that. We're able to imagine and we're able to aspire. We're able to try to realize that imagination. And so much has transpired over these 2 years to give that a legitimacy, to give that space, whether it's in the IDF, whether it's even internally as I look at my Haredi colleagues and the changes taking place there, whether it's on the Temple Mount. There's so much going on that gives us hope. And what keeps you awake at night is our unfortunate disposition to lose this through internal fighting, through the small details that are actually very important, and those often deny us that wonderful ability, that wonderful propensity to do great things. We are an unbelievable nation. We have a wellspring of greatness, but we lose it when we're at each other's throats. And what keeps you up at night is that we might go back there. We're going to have an election cycle coming up now. My deep hope and prayer is that we'll be able to get through it in a way that will perpetuate, that will maintain those moments of amazing unity, those moments of being able to come together. And I'm not talking about 100%, 80%. That's what you want. You want a large majority, and halavai, really, it should be that we should be able to hold it together and to realize those great imaginations that we have the license right now to think about.
Well, let me come to the questions from the audience there. As you say, there are many of them. Elliot, the first one is for you. You mentioned at the very beginning of your remarks that there is a discussion that is active in Israel right now about whether the Israelis are too reliant on American security guarantees, American arms, American military support. So what to do about that? One question is whether how to think about what happens if a future administration, a Democratic administration, a less pro-Israel or isolationist Republican administration should succeed this one. How should the Israelis think about that question?
Carefully. There's a one-word answer. I think they should first be doing what they are saying they will do, which is to try to diminish it in some way. For example, by producing more armaments at home. Secondly, I think they need to really think carefully with American Jews about what might be done to shore up support. For example, I would hope that the day will come. It will not come soon, but let's say in 10 years, when there is no American military aid to Israel, just as today there's no economic aid, where there would be arms sales as there are to other friends and allies, Japan, England, Australia, because I think for some in the United States, that sense of foreign aid dependence actually diminishes what would otherwise be stronger support for the
Mhm.
relationship with Israel. Again, that can't happen now. It may not be feasible while the Islamic Republic of Iran exists, but it's something just to think through. I do think one has to say that Israel is, in many ways, in the position that our European allies are in. Japan is in, Australia is in, Taiwan is in. There are evil forces in the world, Russia, China, Iran, and the strongest country resisting those forces is the United States. And Israel's difficult position, if the United States were to turn away from that struggle, is in many ways not so different from that of other allies whose freedom, whose independence depends on the United States. It's certainly true that you see it in the fears of our friends in the Baltic countries, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and to some degree in all of Western Europe. So that's an inescapable condition of the of the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century. And I think so it's a two-front war, just to repeat myself. Israel should do what it can materially to reduce the dependence, and it should do what it can politically to maintain the support that it has in the United States and elsewhere in the region. And in some ways, it has more support in some of the countries in that region than it does in Western Europe. And it's worth noting that in the middle of this war, this 2-year war with all of these lies about genocide, none of the Abraham Accord countries have broken their ties to Israel.
Melanie, you mentioned in the beginning the Qataris and the role that they've played over the last years and who they are, who they should be with respect to Israel and the West. If the deal moves to the next phase, should we worry about Qatari and Turkish involvement in the direct governance of Gaza?
You bet we should. I mean, it's extraordinary. We were talking earlier about the terrible price that Israel's had to pay to release the hostages and so on. On October the 8th, if America had said to Qatar, right, the hostages come out this evening alive and well, or we're out of here, we take out our base and we treat you as a pariah. In a kind of way, they did that after the attack on Doha, which is supposed to have failed, but actually concentrated Qatari minds rather wonderfully. So at all stages, Qatar's been treated as an honest broker and interlocutor. And as a result, we had 2 years of farcical so-called negotiations in which basically Hamas was negotiating with itself. And we wondered why we were only getting the hostages in dribs and drabs. It was, I'm afraid, America's fault. America had the power to say to Qatar one thing or the other, and it chose not to. Now, quite why it chose not to, we can all speculate. We all have our theories about money and influence and so on. Now, when I read about, the peace that's going to, be the peace of the region forever, it's going to shape the region in a peaceful way, it's going to end the war against Israel, I am filled with joy and happiness and wonderment. And I think, yes, so much has changed in such a way that could now happen, but not with Qatar in it. With Qatar in it, it's going to be the spoiler. If Qatar is involved in Gaza, Hamas will continue to recover and will recover. It may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, but it will recover. If Qatar is involved in what might be, an expanded Abraham Accords, the same thing will happen. Now, I listened to Mr. Witkoff. I mean, he seems a tremendously nice kind of guy. But honestly, he seems completely clueless. He seems to think, that by talking to Hamas about, their dead sons, that they form a kind of equivalence and a bond, and he can get through on a human level, and on that level, you can do wonderful things. What sort of planet is he living in? The Emir of Qatar, I'm sure, is a wonderful host and generous to a fault, but nevertheless, he is the Muslim Brotherhood. How can you have a regional peace which is going to guarantee Israel's security forever when central to that, as I read it is going to be, will be the Muslim Brotherhood, which is engaged in a global attempt to defeat the West and to wipe out Jewish influence and to destroy Israel. This seems to me absolutely crazy. And Turkey is a major problem. I mean, not least because it is a NATO member. It is run by an Islamist whose aim is to destroy the West that NATO is there to protect. I mean, this is another level of awfulness. But you know, we've lived there with that for a kind of long time. And, you know, Erdogan plays a very duplicitous game, as we all know. And I'm not being wet behind the ears. I understand the world of diplomacy means that, you know, you have to, you know, realpolitik, you have to get on with people. You can't do everything at once. You can't say, you know, our hands we must be pure and we must not negotiate or we must not deal with or have anything to do with anyone who's a bad actor. But there comes a point where, you know, the bad actor is so bad and is so inimical to your interests, it is positively suicidal to form an alliance with them. And I think that's what I think about Qatar.
Rabbi Pfeffer, at the very beginning of the war, there seemed that there could be a real change in the way that the Haredi community oriented itself toward the IDF. I think as the war has gone on, there has been what seems to be a reversion to the status quo ante. I want you to talk about what you see, if that impression is correct, what you see in, you know, this, of course, together with you, Rabbi Pfeffer, could be the subject of a whole discussion. But in brief, there's a number of questions that have come up about this from the audience.
Yes, absolutely. So even though, of course, the original, I would say, momentum that we did see within Haredi society for participating in whichever way in the war effort and the sense of unity and that we're in this together against this vicious and monstrous common enemy, that spirit has eroded over time. And the reason for that, of course, is number one, because ultimately the Haredim were not eager to literally join the IDF and send thousands of young men into the armed forces of Israel. They were not eager to do that. And number two, because of the tension that almost inevitably erupted around the moral claim, and it's very difficult to refute the standing of this moral demand for Haredim to shoulder the burden and indeed the privilege of serving in the IDF. And at the same time, there have been really significant developments, and from both sides. Let's remember that the IDF, the army, prior to October 7th, was not particularly interested in Haredim serving in the IDF. The country had an interest, there was a political interest, but the army made it very difficult, and I can say that from deep personal experience, serving on the board of Netzach Yehud, an organization dedicated to supporting Haredi soldiers in the IDF. It was a very torrid and hard time for the very concept of integrating Haredim in the IDF. Since October 7th, that's changed quite dramatically. The army has made real moves to accommodate Haredim in the IDF, and the numbers have risen, not sufficiently, but there are definitely positive motions at hand. At the end of the day, from the Haredi side, two things really need to happen. One thing is an appreciation that the story of Israel, and together with the story of Israel, the IDF that protects that story and that defends it against its adversaries, is our story. It's not their story. We have to, us as the Haredi society, we must internalize that. Without internalizing a mindset of a common us rather than a them and us, well, it's, who wants to serve in their army? It must be. And I do find that this is being internalized. This is slowly, it's a generational shift. It's not an overnight matter, but certainly this is happening, and that's deeply, deeply crucial for this to happen. And the second thing is, as I mentioned before, we need courage. And in this sense, it's the courage of an entire community, the courage to leave that very deep Haredi mindset, which says that the outside world is a threat and a danger. And if you will serve in the IDF, then who knows what will happen, number one, to those youth who are serving in the IDF, but number two, where will that lead the entirety of Haredi society in terms of its identity, in terms of its sense of belonging, in terms of its fidelity to those values of caution and concern, and indeed, right, charada, being anxious of this interaction with the Western world and with all of its dangers and its, caustic elements. And this is not simple. This is a transition. Serving in the IDF for Haredi society would mean a real and deep transition in terms of what does it mean to be Haredi. And it needs a lot of courage to be able to do that. Ultimately, I see that process happening from bottom up, from the field, through people who are trying to lead that charge. I'll let you in on a secret that I myself am drafting into the IDF this week, later this week, starting service next week. And because we need to be able to find that leadership by example, and we have to be able to, if I'm calling for this, I have to do it myself at the end of the day. And I'm not 18, and really we need the 18-year-olds more than we need me. But at the end of the day, it's about coming together as a cohesive and united Israel with the Haredim as a part of it. This is not easy. It's not overnight. Israel doesn't have patience. I imagine this will be strongly articulated at the ballot boxes in the next election cycle. And at the same time, my deepest hopes and aspirations, and this is a lot of the work that I'm doing, is that this should happen by ways of positive transitions and positive stepping up to take that responsibility rather than by means of hostilities and by sticks and stones and sanctions and so on. And time will tell to which degree we'll be able to achieve that.
Rabbi Pfeffer, first of all, congratulations.
Yes.
And thank you for your service. We'll have to have you back because this audience and this host are desperately eager to learn more about all that's to
We
come.
have to have you back in uniform.
Indeed. The last question, we're coming short on the end of our time. The last question, Melanie, there are so many questions that hit this point, which are expressing a kind of anxiety about the future of Jews in the UK and Europe in general. That was not really a major topic of our discussion, but I'd like you to speak into that anxiety and tell us how you see it and what you think.
It's pretty grim. I can't speak much about Europe, which is different from Britain. I know Britain obviously very well. It's pretty grim for two reasons, two related reasons, what the Jews of Britain are up against. And it's what we're all up against, really. It's the alliance between the liberal universalists, for whom God died a long time ago, man is the center of everything, and universalism, universal values have to knock out biblical values and all that. And they are in an unholy alliance with the Islamists, who perceive correctly that what the liberal universalists have done over many decades has been to hollow out the culture of the West, and provide a vacuum into which Islamists can duly march, which in fact they have done. Now, the combination of these two things has been obvious to me for a very long time and has been festering away in anti-Israel attitudes, which are lightly disguised, very often anti-Jewish attitudes. And I would say also that anti-Zionism is at root anti-Judaism, because to me, the land, the people, and the faith are all one. So where does this leave everybody? I mean, the last 2 years have been horrendous for British Jews, and they're getting more and more horrendous. I mean, almost every day something is happening, which, it defies belief, because what one might have thought were decent, civilized, educated people are not recoiling in horror, they're cheering it on. All kinds of things have been happening in public life, which are just a complete destruction of any kind of moral sense, the internalization of the whole Palestinian narrative. And to my mind, The whole Palestinian narrative, which has become the kind of the default cause of causes for the progressive, so-called progressive left, has been a kind of Trojan horse for Islamism. Because if you buy into Palestinianism, which at root is an agenda to destroy, not only destroy Israel, but to steal the Jews' own history in the land from them and appropriate it for themselves, if you buy into that, then you buy into all the Islamist, neo-Nazi demonization of Jews, quite apart from Israel, that comes with Palestinianism. And consequently, you open the way to the horrors that have happened. So how should British Jews behave? How should they think of themselves? Well, a lot of them are thinking a lot about, do we have any future anymore in Britain? Because you have a situation where, to be visibly Jewish, in the immortal words of a police officer who arrested somebody or tried to arrest a prominent young Jew who was returning from synagogue one Shabbat and tried to cross the road to make a point, but tried to cross the road where there was a demonstration, and the policeman basically almost arrested him, threatened him with arrest because he was, quote, visibly Jewish. And this kind of thing is happening all the time. So British Jews are thinking, is there any future for us in Britain? And I think that American Jews are also having the same thought, particularly Jews in New York. If Mr. Mamdani becomes mayor, they're going to be up against something quite similar. So where does this leave British Jews? It leaves them in a very, very, very parlous position. What will be the future? I've always thought, and I've said many times, that the Jews of the diaspora will only be safe if the West decides to save itself, because the West has been in the process of destroying its core identity and values, at the root of which are Jewish values. And it's not surprising, therefore, that the Jews have been in the eye of the storm. The Jews stand against all universalizing ideologies. So they stand in the way of liberal universalism, and they stand in the way of Islamization of Islam. And the West has to decide, is Britain going to go down before Islamization? Is it going to just give up the ghost and say, well, it was nice while it lasted, and, we did invent parliamentary democracy, and we did invent the rule of law and liberty, but that's in the past, and now we just got to get down to it and basically put on the hijabs and have Sharia law? Maybe they will do that. Maybe they will fight. If they fight, and we know from bitter experience, the Jews get it in the neck from all sides, both sides that are fighting. And we don't know whether the West will pull itself together and pull itself out of this. If it does, then the Jews of the diaspora will be relatively safe. Now, there are many people in Israel who view the plight of British Jews and other Jews in the diaspora with a considerable amount of impatience. They say, why are they there? Why are they there? Why don't they just come here? Well, I have more sympathy with diaspora Jews. It's not possible for many people just to up sticks like that. Not least because you can't believe it's happening. And it's all very well for people to say, well, we've been through this before in Germany, and, the Jews of Germany made the same mistake. It's not as simple as that. You're dealing with human beings. You're dealing with a complicated set of situations. So, some people are thinking of moving to Israel. Some people are thinking of, just hunkering down. So it is a very worrying situation, not least because, final point, the current government in Britain, the Labour government under Sir Keir Starmer, is taking the path of least resistance. He is giving in to the pressure being brought upon him by the growing power of the Islamist bloc in Britain. Muslim sectarian politics has raised its head, but also because he is himself a liberal universalist. He is basically a human rights lawyer, and he believes in, two-state solution. He believes that everybody can basically get along, that you mustn't ever go to war and kill people, all that sort of stuff. So he's not stepped up to the plate as far as the Jews of Britain are concerned, and so they are in a really, I think, very difficult situation.
Well, let me just respond very briefly before we adjourn. But Melanie, I want to speak up on behalf of this diaspora community in the United States. I would never say anything, not a word, against any Jew in the world that feels summoned to build their life in Israel. That is a noble calling, and at Tikvah, one that we'd support with every student that we come across. At the same time, for those Jews who are here in America, I think we also need to recognize that whereas it is, I have no reason to doubt a word that you said about the UK, the situation in the UK. The Jews will get it from all sides. It could very well be. In America, my experience is that while there is paroxysms of anti-Semitism, as Elliot very correctly said, and at the same time, there are millions upon millions of friends, many of whom are Christians in the United States, that at this moment are praying for the redemption and the glory and the prosperity of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And this fight is not over. What I take from this conversation, my friends, is that the Iranian nuclear program is set back. The hostages have returned. The alliance between Jerusalem and Washington at this moment is as strong as perhaps it has ever been. Those are real things, and they are things that are worthy of our gratitude. And at the same time, of course, it's true that the work of securing Jewish life and Jewish prosperity continues. That work will require moral sobriety, strategic prudence. But I think that on the basis of this conversation and the many students that we get to work with in Tikvah's programs, I think that we've got a chance. Elliot, Melanie, Rabbi Pfeffer, thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we'll adjourn.